some discussion about Section 230 of the Communications Act. And I wrote that section. It was a key development, in my view, in the growth of the net, because it gave us a chance to deal with smut and some of this junk that families have been so upset without squelching the potential for the net. It enabled content sharers to grow ever since we struck that thoughtful approach rather than just go to a censorship, regime. I've heard that somehow, net neutrality would undo that particular, provision. Nothing could be further from the truth. Net neutrality is exactly about what I sought to do in the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was to make sure that all voices could flourish, not just the voices of a few, but all voices could flourish. And if anybody wants to talk a bit more about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, I'm happy to have that discussion. But as the author of that provision, it's something that I and a lot of other people who've worked in this field have felt was essential to the growth of the net. And we share that view, just as we believe, as the President of the Senate has, that net neutrality is critical to the growth of the Internet in the years ahead, because the fundamental principles that underlie both Section 230 and net neutrality are the same. Now, Mr. President, the debate about the Federal Communication Commission's decisions go right to the heart of what the Internet is all about. It has always been a platform where all the actors are equal, where everybody has that opportunity, as you suggested, at the American dream. It's a place where, whether it is one dissenting voice screaming out for democratic change or one brilliant idea that forever changes the way that people and society organize, everyone has that opportunity. Now, I chair the Senate Finance Subcommittee on International Trade, and as just one example, I think what we've seen is the Internet is going to be the shipping lane of the 21st century. This is the way societies are going to organize. This is the way people are going to come together. This is the way business is going to be conducted. And basically, net neutrality protects everybody's access to that shipping lane. It's not just going to be a place for the old world business models. You bet the old world business models are threatened by net neutrality. I understand that. I understand that they're threatened by it. They've always been able to count on big, powerful, and well-connected interests and organizations to help them to dominate industry. And the net overturns that kind of thinking, because it's the equalizer, it's the democratizer. And it just seems to me that when we open our morning newspaper day after day and see that the hope of the country is in innovation, in startups, in new ideas, and it's not just in Silicon Valley, it's all over the country and all over the world, the last thing we'd want to do here in our country is adopt rules that would retard that development. And my view is the power of the net, the network, is best utilized when content can move freely through it, and that's whether it's free from taxes, from liability, and certainly from the kind of discrimination that would be allowed if the net neutrality rules were overturned. And again, I touched on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and why that was so important to the growth of the net, and why I think net neutrality is consistent with that. Same with respect to some of the other legislation I've been heavily involved in. I had the privilege of being one of the co-authors of the Internet Tax Freedom Bill. And what that was all about was trying to protect the net from discrimination. Not all taxes altogether, but discrimination. That, too, is a fundamental principle of the net neutrality rules, is trying to make sure that the net is not going to be singled out by a handful of special interests who could, in effect, devise what amounts to their own lanes on the internet and force everybody else to pay for it. So despite what may even be the interests of some of these, powerful, interest, groups, and I know they're all saying now that they have no intent to discriminate against content over their networks. History shows that they cave every time when shareholders come and say, look, you've got to take this step to generate a profit. And I just think the internet is too important to leave those kinds of decisions vulnerable to what is inevitably going to be the cry from shareholders and others to maximize profit. One last 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 profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One last profit. One profit. One last 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 profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. One last profit. Last profit. Last profit. One last profit.